Hello there! Welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing incredibly well. I'm doing great, thank you very much. And here we are on part 2 of our story, and we've learnt of a family's dreadful tragedy. A woman who was in her 50s, well, she turned 50, discovered that she was actually pregnant, and at first it was not received very enthusiastically by her 2 children, who were older in age and didn't appreciate their mother at 50 years old being pregnant. But 2 days after the baby is born, the baby is found dead in its bassinet at the hospital, dying of SIDS, which is, premature death in a baby, which sometimes happens. And there's no explanation as to why the baby dies, it just does. And there are cases of SIDS all over the world, when a baby just dies with no rhyme or reason. And so the family were absolutely devastated by little Daisy's death, and they're trying to come to terms with it because maybe they didn't want her in the beginning, but they now want her, and she's no longer there. And so Athel, who's the father, is thinking long and hard about this in the cemetery because he does not want his family to suffer the consequences of all their grief, because he can see his wife is very broken. So he's clearly having a long, hard think. And his revelation is that life is too short. We need to grab it by both hands and make a decision to improve our lives so that we can heal ourselves. So let's continue with part 2 of our story. For far too long, Athel had always been the kind of man that diligently plodded along dutifully with his job, from one day to the next, because that is what you did in order to provide a good living for your family, to put food on the table, and to pay all the bills. Athel had liked the continued predictability of life. It had made him feel safe and secure. He'd always been afraid of change of any kind, making different choices, even though he was often tempted to make them, but never quite had the courage to do so. But after Daisy's fortuitous passing, it had changed many things for him, putting him at a crossroads in his life, where he decided he needed to make some challenging decisions once and for all. Athel had always hated that, but now was not the time to dawdle or procrastinate. He would take the bull by the horns and do what he would have done a long time ago if courage had been his friend. It would seem the things that had rarely mattered in his life were now beginning to stare him blazingly in the face, demanding his prompt attention, as if to say, "Don't forget about us. We actually matter." Everything else, like his job in downtown Atlanta and the Christmas celebrations the next few days invited, seemed suddenly like nonsensical supercilious fluff to him. Athel's priorities had shifted exponentially, and it had all happened while he sat there, on the hard wood of the chapel pew, as if a pole shift had occurred within him, that like an unlikely seed growing on stony ground, a green shoot had appeared, a shoot of recovery that might offer a brand new opportunity for the Palmer family. And a new beginning is exactly what they needed. Even as Athel sat there rigidly on the seat, thinking long and hard about a future with new promise, unbeknown to him, his daughter Chloe, sitting on the other side of him, was also seeding similar ideas of her own, although hers were much more unorthodox and unconventional, much like Chloe herself, who prided herself in thinking outside the box all the time. One thing about Chloe is that, much like her father, she always liked to fix anything that was broken, and the Palmer family needed lots of fixing. While she sat there on the rock-hard pew that reminded her all too uncomfortably of where she was, she had hatched an outrageous plan that she believed emphatically would bring a smile to her mother's face, while the service continued on, like an old record that had been replayed over and over again, in this bleak chapel, where every heart that had entered this place had been broken, and every tear that had ever been shed had been recorded in this place, for this was the kind of chapel that spoke only of grief and loss, like the words in a very solemn book. The funeral service in the cemetery chapel had gone by in an ambiguous foggy blur. If Paulette tried to remember it, she did recall how freezing cold it had been on that day. She had huddled inside her thick winter coat made all the more cold by her dreadful loss. The funeral director had made some rather mute apologies about a thermostat that wasn't working properly. She recalls holding her husband's hand very tightly and staring bleakly at the white coffin. Beyond that, friends and family were there on the day, but they seemed to vanish from her recall, as if they were the scenic backdrop at the theatre that drifted into obscurity. She didn't remember the prayers that the pastor had prayed, nor the wooden songs that were sung, but she did remember that white coffin being lowered into the ground in the children's part of the cemetery. She had seen a couple who were replacing the flowers at their own child's grave stop what they were doing as they looked at the large gathering of mourners standing over the newly dug grave, as if to honour little Daisy, as they lowered her to the ground. Paulette remembered the mother looking up at her, with eyes of a mother who understood her grief, and the woman had nodded at her with a sombre, sorrowful look, as if to say, "I know exactly what you're going through. You have my deepest condolences. You really do." Paulette also vividly remembered her daughter Chloe, taking her into her arms as she sobbed into her mother's thick winter coat, that had become surprisingly damp from her daughter's tears. Her daughter's words had rung clearly into her head, like a resounding church bell. "I'll make this better, Mum, for you, I promise you, and for the entire family. I'm going to fix this for us." Paulette had wondered how anyone could make anything better, now that Daisy was gone from their lives. Paulette had no way of knowing that the new year would open out in front of her, unfolding very delicately like a beautiful rose, with many unexpected surprises up its sleeve, that she'd never have ever seen coming in a million months of Sundays. And had Daisy not died in the way she had done, none of these things would have ever transpired, so it almost seemed like their dead little girl had sent them all a gift. 1 month later. "Where are we going, Athol?" asked Paulette, looking at her husband with a questionable brow, as they drove away from their sleepy Atlanta suburb. "I told you it's a surprise," Athol assured her, giving her a huge grin. "You know, Athol, that I don't like surprises of any kind," Paulette had complained. "I've had too many in my life. I don't think I could stomach any more." "But you will like this one," Athol had promised her. "I'm taking you somewhere very special, Paulette. We're going to take a trip into the countryside, and you're going to love it. Indeed, this is a trip you won't forget in a hurry." Athol's 4-wheel drive steadily meandered down some sequestered country roads in the Jordan countryside, sprinkled with snow. Paulette wondered if her husband was taking her out for lunch somewhere. A cosy inn, perhaps, where she could enjoy the lovely benefits of a crackling fire and some hearty food. He was a thoughtful man in that regard, and after Daisy's dreadful passing, he had handled her with kid gloves, almost as if she was a fragile porcelain doll that he was desperately afraid would break in his hands. She knew the whole family had been so grief-stricken by her baby's death, but no one more so than herself. Every night, unbeknown to her family, she would shed tears for her baby girl, crying into the pillow until exhaustion got hold of her and would finally whisk her off to La La Land. It was down an undulating bend in the road that Athol's 4-wheel drive began to rattle and shake rather precariously, as baby stones pinged against the underbelly of the car. Everywhere they looked, the tall, lofty trees framing both sides of the road were covered in garlands of white snow, and in a dramatic way, everything did look rather sensational. "I want you to close your eyes," Athol had told Paulette at one stage of their journey. "We're getting close to our destination, you see. Put this on," he said, handing her a blindfold. "What's this about, Athol?" she asked, looking at him suspiciously. "Put it on." So Paulette obediently obliged his request, wondering where her husband was taking her to. She could sense he was now driving down what seemed to be a long driveway, perhaps. Finally his car came to a halt. She was expecting to remove the blindfold, open her eyes, and find herself staring at a quaint country inn, where they would enjoy a lovely, delicious lunch together. Instead, she opened her eyes to find herself staring at a beautiful double-story wooden farmhouse, surrounded by trees, and overlooking expanses of land covered in carpets of glistening snow. It was as pretty as a picture. "Where are we, Athol?" she asked, raising an arched eyebrow and looking at her husband in bewilderment. "I've never seen this place before." "We're visiting friends of yours, are we, that live in this gorgeous home? Oh, goodness gracious me, imagine living in a place like this. I do envy them. Is this the boss you were telling me about? Is this his house that he bought in the countryside? I remember you saying he wanted to invite us to lunch. Is that why we're here? Why all the secrecy over this, Athol?" "No, silly. We're home," said Athol. "What do you think?" he said, placing a cold set of keys in her hand. Paulette took the keys from her husband in bemusement. She looked up at the farmhouse and then straight back at Athol. "I don't understand, Athol. What are you talking about? What do you mean we are home? You're not making any sense to me at all." "Don't you like it? I bought the place for us. This is our new home. It's a new start to our lives. Do you like it?" "It's the most beautiful place I've ever seen. But I don't understand. But what about your job in downtown? What about our house in the suburbs? What about the kids?" Athol pressed one of his fingers against his wife's lips to quieten down all the questions. "It's sorted, love. Everything is sorted. I've spoken to my boss in the offices. He says I only need to come to work 1 day a month. I can keep my job. He says I've been too much of an invaluable asset for him to lose me now. So I don't need to be there every day. It's worked out better than I could have ever envisaged. I thought I'd have to look for another job. But these days things are changing in the workplace. So I can work from home on my computer and only go to the office once a month. As for the kids, they're going to move in with our parents, so they can continue along with their education, and will stay here at the weekends. The kids are very thrilled with this new home of ours. They love it here." "You brought them here, have you? But how could you buy this place without me seeing it first? And we don't have any disposable income to be able to just buy a place like this." "I borrowed the money from my father. He was more than happy to give me a loan. He knows the hell we've been through of late, losing little Daisy. He thought moving to the countryside was the new start we both needed. And he's in on the surprise. He thought you needed some cheering up." "Well, I don't know what to say, Athol. This is absolutely incredible. This is one of the most beautiful things that anybody has ever done for me. And frankly, I wouldn't have had the energy to have done this myself. So I'm so grateful you've done this for me." "This is what you've been wanting, Paulette, for a very long time. You told me, love, that you fancied living in the countryside, didn't you? How long have you been going on and on about the fact that you've always believed that at heart you were a thoroughbred country girl, who's never lived in the country, but knows that this is where she belongs? You, my love, have been telling me this for many years. If you remember, you would go on and on about how you've never liked living in a city." "Yes, but never for a second did I believe moving into the countryside would ever be viable for us. I mean, that was just so out of the question, I thought. I know you too well, Athol. You're incredibly set in your ways, aren't you? You've never lived in the country before, and you hate change. Besides, we were living in an enviable Atlanta neighborhood, where I thought we would live out our days. I didn't think my dream would ever be fully realized, and I'd actually get to live in a place like this." "A man can change his mind, can't he? Are you going to come in or not, and see this beautiful new home for yourself? Or are you going to stare gormlessly at the place?" he teased, grabbing his wife's hand and giving it an encouraging squeeze. "I don't understand you, Athol. I really don't. You've recently become a complete conundrum to me. Why on earth would you do something like this? Buy a property on a whim? This is so unlike you. It's out of character." "I told you. I had an epiphany, love, when I was sitting there in the chapel at the funeral for our baby girl. This you see before you is because of little Daisy. She made me do this, love. When Daisy died, do you know what I thought?" "What did you think, Athol?" "When I was sitting there in the pew,
I just thought of all the inconsequential stuff that I've worried about before in my life, and it seemed to melt away like butter on a corn cob, sliding to the bottom of the plate, if you know what I mean. Daisy made me realize what really matters in life. She put everything in perspective for me. So that little baby girl did so much for me. She made me reevaluate my entire life. So her birth and death have changed me. Thanks to her, I decided we needed a brand new start, that we're going to live out our dream. The very next day after we put her body to rest, I started my search for the perfect home for us in the countryside. I got in touch with the estate agents, telling them I was looking for a house in the countryside, as I wanted to relocate. And, well, here we are now.
Is that why you were always going off on random trips? Was it to view properties?
Yes, that's the reason, love. I knew we needed a new beginning. I really don't want us to go back to living in the same neighborhood, because it's like playing, what is that game called?
Groundhog Day, all over again, is that what you're saying?
You thought that we would continually think about little Daisy, something like that. One of the estate agents I've been seeing, a man called Philip Marlowe, he got in touch with me. He told me about this place that had recently come on the market. The family was moving to Canada. So I put an offer in at once. In my gut, I knew it was perfect for us. It was a gamble, of course, choosing a place without your intervention. Well, I have to admit, I took your mother around the property. You know what your mother's like. She's got excellent, impeccable taste. I knew if she liked the place, so would you, because the two of you are like two birds of a feather. So when she said this place was absolutely idyllic, and she could imagine you loving it, well, I didn't hesitate to put an offer in straight away.
Goodness gracious, Athel, I can't believe all the things you've been doing behind my back. Anybody would think you were having an affair. To think I didn't know any of this was happening. I do like the changes I'm seeing in you, Athel. Going out of a limb like this. Honestly, Athel, this is just the most wonderful thing you've done for me. I keep pinching myself, asking myself if this place really is mine.
It is yours. It's ours, shall I say.
When Paulette looked around the magnificently beautiful farmhouse her husband had bought for them to rebuild their lives, she was overwhelmed by his generosity. The hurt she felt over Daisy's passing was a lot more bearable. Not that it would ever really go away, but she knew Daisy had a lot to do with her husband buying this place. And it was a good decision to move here. It would be the quintessential opportunity for them to rebuild their broken lives. Within days, their house in the suburbs had not only been put on the market, but had been sold on the first open day, where an eager couple had given them the full asking price. 2 weeks later, they had happily settled into their brand new country home, and their children, who loved the property, would come over for the weekends. It really did feel like an auspicious new beginning for the Palmer family. Everything about this move felt auspiciously right, as if little Daisy herself had led the family here by her tiny little hands. The little baby was responsible for all these miraculous changes in their lives. Paulette really believed this to be the case. She knew it was uncharacteristic and atypical for the mulishly stubborn Athel, who was resolutely set in his ways, to have made a move like this, which she knew could never have transpired before Daisy's passing. It would seem even the quirky, rather eclectic, individualistic furnishings from her previous home address that had never really belonged in that house in suburbia looked as if they had been made for their brand new home in the countryside, with its high ceilings, wood-panelled walls, and large, friendly open fireplaces. The previous owners had very generously left behind all the original high-quality curtains in the rooms, which clearly had not come cheap, along with some furniture that had been especially handcrafted for the property, and would have been cumbersome to move to a new address in Canada. The central staircase with its wrought iron balustrades was a focal point to the stunning, sumptuously stylish home. On the upper floor there was the most beautiful nursery, with yellow and white wallpaper and pictures of ducks, as the previous owners had recently had a baby girl. Paulette had promptly locked the nursery the moment she had seen it,
deciding that as long as she lived in this house, which she hoped would be forever, she would never ever go into that room, for it hurtfully reminded her of all she'd lost. She had been very grateful that Chloe had thoughtfully disposed of all the baby stuff she had purchased, the cots and the little baby things that she'd never ever get to use, because if she saw any of those things again, it would bring her grievous despair back like a huge tsunami wave. Paulette was sitting in the living room staring up from the magazine at the stone fireplace, where she watched the feisty flames happily frolicking over the wood. She loved real open fires like this, and this fireplace was the focal point of the room, with its large marble mantel. The family's black Labrador poodle mix, Otis, seemed to agree on this. He was lying with his paws splayed luxuriantly over the thick woolen rug. His head rested over Paulette's feet. He liked to be close to the fire, fully appreciating the warmth it provided in the sumptuously cosy wooden-panelled room. Otis must have thought he'd died and gone to heaven when they came here, and he'd been over the moon when every morning and evening Athol had religiously taken him out for long energetic walks in the woods, without having to be annoyingly tethered to his lead, like when he was in the suburbs. It would seem Otis fully appreciated the freedom of country life, almost as much as the Palmers did. Even Athol would say over and over again, as he lovingly scooped his wife in his arms to give her a reassuring hug, "We should have done this a long time ago, love. The reason we didn't is because I lacked the courage. I really love living out here in the country, and the folk in town have been so welcoming to us, apart from that disagreeable next-door neighbour of ours, who breeds golden retrievers. Now she was rather aloof and disapproving, don't you think?" Paulette pulled a face in agreement. "Are you telling me, Athol? She looked down on me because we come from the city. I think she genuinely believes we're above our heads moving here. She said to me city folk can never make it in the countryside, that we'll be back to our safe green leafy Atlanta suburb faster than you can say Jack Robinson. I think she disapproves of city folk moving to the countryside. It's an inverted snobbery, you could say. Well, she's wrong about us, isn't she? Especially you, Paulette. You were made to live in the countryside, and that golden retriever breeder, whatever her name is, will soon find she's wrong about us. I think her name's Alice Garner, actually. Well, whoever she is, Alice Garner or not, she's wrong about us. I feel as if we're meant to live here." "So do I," Paulette admitted. "I've never been as happy as I am now. Of course, I dreadfully miss our Daisy. But living out here has made things so much more bearable for me." Paulette glanced past the fireplace towards the large glass sliding doors that opened out onto a patio, overlooking the long sweep of the countryside, heavily upholstered with thick carpets of glistening white snow. She couldn't help but think how lucky they were to live in such an idyllic part of the world, and in such a snug and cosy home. But there was still so much to do, as boxes from the move, all marked with black Sharpie pen, were still liberally scattered all over the house. They needed to be unpacked and organised. But Paulette, in her grief, was still struggling to put things in order. In truth, the house still looked rather like a loading bay in a warehouse. Athol was sitting back on the burgundy gold and green striped wing chair, with his head firmly entrenched in a novel he was reading. Paulette couldn't understand why her husband liked reading thrillers so much, but he always claimed there was nothing more satisfying than a good old murder mystery. "I'm going for a walk, Athol," she told him. Athol looked up at her from his book. "What was that you said, love?" "I was saying I'm going out for a walk. I think Otis would really appreciate one, don't you? And I really could do with some fresh air. It's a long time since I've been outside. It might actually inspire me to come back and unpack some of those boxes that desperately need to be unloaded. I've been putting it off for far too long." At the word walk, Otis looked up and let out a happy woof, his tail thumping vigorously hard against the woolen rug. Athol looked up at his wife beneath a raised, somewhat sceptical brow. As it would seem ever since Daisy's death, his wife never expressed much interest in doing very much, so her sudden eagerness to take an energetic walk made him almost dare to hope that at long last the old Paulette he knew and loved, the woman that always had such a zest for life and a spring to her step, that had been buried beneath her fragile emotions,
after Daisy's death, was finally coming back to him.
"I knew coming here was a good idea," he told himself privately. "A walk? You want to go for a walk? Well, that's a jolly good idea if you ask me. You haven't been for a walk in ages. I know Otis would really appreciate one. Look at the way he's looking at you now, with such expectation on his face. You can't turn him down now, not with an expression like that. I was actually going to take him out later. Would you like me to come with you, love, to accompany you, perhaps?"
"No, actually I wouldn't. I'd like to go out on my own, if I may. With Otis, of course. I mean, we've been here for 2 weeks now, and I haven't even explored this property, let alone finished unpacking those boxes as I was telling you that the movers brought. So I'm hoping the walk might actually revive my depleted, rather flagging energy."
"Well, a walk will definitely do you good, Paulette. Bring some colour back to those cheeks of yours. But make sure you're warmly dressed, will you? It looks quite cold out there. I don't want you coming down with a cold or something."
"Listen to you, Athel. You do worry about the most crazy things. You know me, I've got a great immune system. I'd not come down with anything." Paulette knew her husband was watching her from the living room window as she walked through the snow. He rarely had looked astounded when she had told him she wanted to go for a walk. There had been a renewed look of hope in his eyes, a look she hadn't seen on her husband's face for many weeks now. She knew her husband was hoping that moving to the countryside would bring her out of her shell, and it would seem it was doing just that. Otis was rambunctiously running ahead of her, sniffing the ground with his eager nose, his body running around in frenzied circles that made Paulette chuckle privately to herself. Otis could be such a clown at times, and it would seem he could not believe his luck that his human mother, who had not walked him since before Christmas, was now walking him again, just like the good old days. Things were definitely looking up. So there they were, owner and dog, walking in the snow, leaving behind a long trail of prints. It was a long time since Paulette had been out of doors like this, with the wind blowing against her cheeks. When they'd lived in suburbia, she'd take Otis for walks twice a day, on a lead. But that had all ended after Daisy's death, so her son Boyd had taken over the reins of the dog-walking duties. And since they'd come here to the countryside, her husband had taken over the job. But now she was taking Otis out for her very first walk with him. Paulette had become like a hermit after Daisy died. She had simply refused to leave her home. She had slowly sunk into a deep depression, as she had been inconsolable with her grief, and none of the antidepressant medications the doctors had begged her to take appeared to have worked in the slightest. She wasn't even sure they helped to soften the sharp edges of her grief. Sometimes it had been close to impossible to actually manage to find the energy in order to drag herself out of bed on a morning, made so much worse by the insufferable cold weather that winter invited, and in her grief the blasts of icy cold air around the house seemed worse this year than they ever had before. Life had become so tortuously hard, and there had been scant moments that she had clandestinely wished with all her heart that when God had taken little Daisy away up to the pearly gates in heaven, that she had been taken along as well. It had been in those morbidly dark, bleak and lonely moments when a darkness seemed to have descended over her like an ominous thundercloud that would not abate. It had been so oppressive, sucking out all her joy, all her hope, like a straw sucking up the rich goodness of a delicious creamy milkshake, leaving behind only an empty glass. Likewise, Paulette had felt the same kind of vacuous, hollow emptiness that many describe as hopelessness and despair. It's when you reach that rock-bottom place where there is nowhere else to fall. Paulette had wondered, during these bloodlessly dispiriting and repressive intervals, where her melancholia had been fully entertained, what the point was to anything any more. Why had God chosen to take one of the most precious things from her? He had given her a much-treasured, beautiful baby girl as a gift, and then just simply taken her away. It had seemed so senseless, so incomprehensible,
so futile and unavailing. At one point she'd actually been somewhat religious, but not any more. She now hated God for his acrimonious ruthlessness towards her. What loving father would inflict such pain on his own daughter? If he really loved her, that is. Did God not say that none of his children would have to face more than they could bear? Well, losing Daisy had been more than she could bear, and yet she'd been put through this despondency, for reasons she would never be able to comprehend or understand. Some may say her faith had been fully tested, and there were times, like so many who've been in her situation, that she was angry at God. Somehow coming to this magnificent, prepossessing house in the countryside had changed the dark, sombre moodiness that had consumed her life, like a cantankerous, unquenchable wildfire that you simply cannot put out. Paulette's wholehearted eagerness to explore the woods had taken even her by surprise. When she got up this morning, it had been easier to get out of bed for some reason, and her appetite seemed to have returned. It had been lost since Christmas. Now here she was, walking with her dog for the first time in ages. It felt fabulously good to be out in nature again, breathing the cold, crisp air. Could she dare to admit that things were getting a little better, a little easier, and the dense, thick, repressive, soul-crushing shadow over her life was slowly retreating, allowing a little sunshine to trickle through? Of course, she knew her life would never ever be the same again. How could it be? But on this unassuming, demure winter's morning, when everything was so timidly quiet, so self-effacing, it just felt brighter. It felt lighter and different. For the first time in a long time, Paulette realized she was actually smiling. That wretchedly hilarious buffoon of a dog was giving her a good old chuckle, as he ran around and around in circles. "I'm happier than I've been for a long time," she thought. "I never knew I would smile again." But she knew there was a smile planted on her lips that she could not wipe away. If Athel were to see her now, he would be amazed, for she could not remember the last time she'd actually smiled. So there we are. That is the end of part 2. Part 3 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.